if you're sitting at home listening to this or on your commute and you're thinking, well, I earn about £60,000 and I wouldn't consider myself a higher earner. You actually are. You are roughly in the 75th percentile of earners, which means you earn more than 75% of the population if you're just north of £60,000 a year.
Yeah.
And last year's median was somewhere around £35,000. So kind of 50% of the population earn below £35,000. Meet over half of the working world. They are the machine that powers our society, from pouring your coffee and emptying your bins, through to caring for a relative or delivering your parcels. You may see them as essential or frontline workers, or you might not see them at all. The Invisible Worker podcast explores the financial landscape of Britain's most diligent workforce. We speak to experts in policy, inclusion, and research to understand their challenges and start to figure out how we can solve them. Hi, I'm Emily. I'm the host of the Invisible Worker podcast. On today's episode, we're exploring the behavioural science of money decisions and asking the question, do higher earners understand the financial lives of lower earners? And what does this mean for the people who make policy, product and service decisions that affect the majority? I'm here with Owain Service.
Hi, Emily.
Hi, Owain. CEO of COGCO.
That's
Honorary
right.
Professor of Behavioural Science at Warwick Business School.
That's right, yeah.
And former founder of the Behavioural Insights team.
That's right, alongside my former colleagues, yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you for joining us on the show today, Owain.
It's great to be here.
We've got a lot to talk about today, but I'd love if you could kick us off with a little bit more about your background and how you came to form COGCO.
Sure. Well, I studied social and political sciences at university. Back then, there wasn't really a dedicated behavioural science program.
Back then, we're dating ourselves, are we?
Yeah. And behavioural science is all about the study of human behaviour. Uh-huh. And the program that I was on as an undergrad was all about a combination of social psychology, anthropology, and politics. So it wasn't that much of a surprise that I found myself working for many years in government, mainly on sort of big strategic programs. So examples of that include things like, what does it feel like for somebody who's receiving a letter from HMRC? Or what does it feel like?
Not good, I can tell you.
Well, it depends what it is, right? There's a sort of interesting behavioural angle to this, some of which we looked at back in the day. So, for example, if you get a letter from HMRC that tells you that this year you paid too much tax and here's £100.
Yeah, that one feels good.
That one feels great,
that
right?
letter.
Yeah. But actually in sort of pure economic terms, theoretically, that should be worse than the experience that a lot of people have, which is you owe us £100, okay? Because if you're receiving a tax rebate from HMRC, that means you paid them, let's say, £100 more than you should have. And that £100 you could have put to good use. You could have put it in a high interest savings account. You could have invested it. But actually, from a psychological perspective, it feels much, much better to get that letter from HMRC saying, here's £100, than one saying, actually, you owe us money.
£100. Because in the latter example, you've had use of that £100 all year and maybe you've done great things with it.
Yeah. And
so you should feel better off, right?
Yeah, no, exactly. And one of the things, Emily, we've talked about before is this notion of £1 is not always the same as £1 in another context, in a different situation, right?
Yes.
So in behavioural science terms, the jargonistic term for this is mental accounting. We have these psychological accounts that we put different pots of money in, and we spend them differently depending on which account they might be.
Yeah, and that's really interesting because we did a piece of research at WageStream a couple of years ago, and we looked at how people felt when they had to dip into their savings for everyday expenses. So kind of in peak cost of living, when a lot of people were really struggling and having to kind of move different pots of money around, and having to dip into your savings for everyday expenses was costing people an extra 50 days of worry a year.
Right.
So they were worrying on average once a week more frequently because they were using a pot of money that they had designated not for everyday expenses, but actually having to use it for that reason.
Yeah. And you find this in all kinds of different situations, which is it's not just about the money, it's about the psychological wrapper that you put around that money. So it's why, a lot of people will end up with a savings account.
Yeah.
And then also a credit card debt. In financial terms, that makes no sense. You shouldn't have those two things operating at the same time. If you're paying, say, 35% interest on your credit card debt and getting only like 5% for your savings. But it's quite a common thing to do because people will put these different mental wrappers around those different forms of expenditure and savings.
So I think this is a good moment to zoom out and talk about kind of behavioral science more broadly. Can I put you on the spot to give a definition to it?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so behavioral science is really like the study of human behavior and decision making. So why do we do the things that we do? So one example that I often use is if you think about how you go about deciding what you might want to have for lunch in any given day. So if it's a Wednesday and you're going to work and you're thinking about how you might go about purchasing your lunch, very few people look at all of the available options, work out what the costs and the benefits of each of the different options that you might have are, and then decide on the one which optimizes the benefits for them personally. And that sounds almost like a kind of ridiculous thing to say because it's obvious that nobody does that.
No one behaves that way.
Yeah.
What do you fancy? And is it in your budget?
Yeah,
Maybe it's as far as it goes.
Exactly. Or like, what are my colleagues having for lunch? What's my partner preparing that I can also then have? In fact, about a third of people just have what they had yesterday.
But that's really interesting. And that is kind of what I wanted to get into, which is kind of what is the psychology around human behavior and particularly related to money.
Yeah.
And there was a few concepts I wanted you to run us through.
Yeah.
And the first one is loss aversion.
Oh, yeah. So loss aversion is a jargonistic way of saying that we think about losses, or losses capture our imagination much more than equivalent gains do.
Yeah.
And most of the research in this area says that we feel the pain of a loss about twice as much as we feel the benefit of an equivalent gain. And the study that you're referring to goes back to the 1980s. And that research looked at what happens if you give somebody something like a mug with a university logo on it.
Yeah, it was Cornell University, wasn't it?
It was a Cornell University mug in the original study, but it's also been run with pens and lots of other trinkets. So you give somebody, I could give you a mug and say, this is your mug. I'd now like to buy that mug from you. How much would you sell it to me for? And let's say that you say to me, well, I'd sell it to you for £3.
Yeah.
Now, what happens in another scenario is that I just say to you, look, I've got this mug, this Cornell University mug. How much would you like to buy it from me for? And the answer typically is £1.50. If you already possess something, then you give it value that it doesn't have if you don't possess that same artifact. So the mere fact that you possess this mug means that you value it more
it's
than
worth more to you.
Exactly the same mug that you could have purchased from me in a different context.
Is that why we struggle to throw out all our old mugs and clear out our homes?
I think it is. It's closely related to the concept known as the IKEA effect.
Oh, I haven't heard of that one.
So the IKEA effect is all about the fact that if you have created something yourself, then you give it more value.
Oh, so you've built your own flat pack.
Yeah.
And it's very important too.
Yeah.
These concepts, so particularly coming back to loss aversion, where it kind of hurts more to have something taken away, that's really played out in recent years in cost of living crisis, where people have felt their quality of life squeezed because they're no longer able to maybe have the same quality that they once had, or they've had to maybe swap to a cheaper form of food shopping or a different food outlet, or go on fewer holidays. And maybe that relates to why people found it so difficult to spend their savings, because it was this idea that you had these savings and they were there to do a job. And it felt very uncomfortable. We could talk about this all day, but I want to move on to the next part of the conversation.
Yeah.
And you briefly touched on this, but kind of the history of the nudge unit at number 10 and how that turned into the behavioural insights team. Can you kind of step back in time and take us through what happened and kind of how it all unfolded?
We kind of created the behavioural insights team. It became known as the nudge unit, but it's one and the same. It was in 2010, and there were a number of different factors back then that influenced like why we set up the unit when we did. One of them was that it was a few years after the financial crisis.
Yes.
Right? So governments around the world were starting to think, okay, well, what can we do that doesn't cost any money? So there were these different elements that came together in 2010 that gave us quite a lot of impetus for creating the Behavioural Insights team. And so in those early days, we effectively got together a small group of people from what used to be the Prime Minister's strategy unit and set up this very small team in the Cabinet Office and Number 10. So some of the early work focused on things like, how do you encourage people to pay their tax on time?
Yeah.
And there were these really interesting studies that we ran back then with HMRC that showed that, for example, if you tell people how many other people are already paying their tax on time, it encourages more people to pay their tax sooner than they might have otherwise done.
Yeah, we're social creatures, aren't we? So we kind of want to move to what's normal.
Yeah.
And so that's really interesting, because I think the previous approach was much more around pointing out how many people weren't doing it. And you kind of go, great, everybody's not doing it, I won't do it too.
Yeah. And what that does is it creates what we call in behavioural science terms a negative social norm, right? So it basically sends a signal that this is the standard behaviour. And then once you've done that, you can then start to think about some of the more nuanced applications of behavioural science. So the application of social norms, telling people what other people are already doing, right, is really effective, but it's nowhere near as effective as just making it simple.
Taking friction out, using inertia in people's favour, or in favour of what you're trying to achieve.
And one thing that government struggles with a lot, and often it struggles for very good reasons, which is that, we have to think long and hard about things like data protection and ensuring that more vulnerable customers who can't always, use the internet, for example, are able to access services. But one thing that government does still struggle with is removing frictions in systems and processes. So if you've ever had to fill in a government form,
sludge, I hear the term is called.
The term is sludge, and it's not just governments, but if you've ever tried to unsubscribe to an online magazine or newspaper, or you've ever tried to communicate with an airline that owes you compensation and go through their online system, which is deliberately constructed to make it hard for you to communicate with another human being, that's sludge.
Yeah.
And sludge can be a deliberate thing, sometimes used in the private sector, deliberately to stop you from unsubscribing or from getting your compensation. In government, it's almost always not deliberate, but it's there because the good intentions of the individuals who are setting up that system didn't know how to remove the friction in order to ultimately improve the service for both themselves and the users.
I think that's a really interesting point, the good intentions of the person setting up the system. And we're gonna come back to this and probably keep coming back to this.
Yeah, okay.
But it's kind of who's in charge of the systems and who are the users of the systems, and they're often very different people. Owain, when we started talking about doing this podcast, I said to you, come on, tell the story of behavioural science, tell about the nudge unit. And you said to me, that's boring, that's been done before. Now, I disagree with you. I think we could spend probably hours talking about it. But you said to me, let's do some innovative new research around the concept of the invisible worker.
Yeah.
So we've got something interesting to talk about.
Yeah.
And so we do.
Yeah, I think we do. And I think it's pretty fresh and interesting and quite novel the way that we went about doing it.
So, Owain, we've done some research together, WageStream and Cogco.
Yeah.
And we've been looking at how different people kind of experience money. So how they spend money, how they save, how much is left over at the end of the month.
Yeah.
But what's really interesting about this research is we split it into two income brackets.
That's right.
So lower earners who earn less than £25,000 a year, and higher earners who earn more than £60,000 a year.
That's right, yeah. But the really interesting thing for me was that the very big difference in the way that we ran this research was to ask them questions not just about their own circumstances, but how they imagined the lives of the people in the other group to be. So we asked people in the higher income bracket what they thought the situation of the people in the lower income bracket was, and vice versa.
You know, if you're sitting at home listening to this or on your commute and you're thinking, well, you know, I earn about £60,000 and I wouldn't consider myself a higher earner. You actually are. You are roughly in the 75th percentile of earners, which means you earn more than 75% of the population if you're just north of £60,000 a year. Yeah. And last year's median was somewhere around £35,000. So kind of 50% of the population earn below £35,000.
And actually, there's a really interesting element to this, which is that almost nobody thinks that they're really wealthy.
Yeah.
And so what we're doing a lot of the time when we're considering our personal lot, we're not really reflecting on our objective situation. As you say, you might well think that you're not a high earner if you're earning more than £60,000. But what you are doing if you are in that situation is comparing yourself to people who earn more than you.
Yes.
Not reflecting on everybody who earns a lot less than you, which is most people. And so it's not surprising in many ways that we have this this element of comparison about the way that we situate ourselves, but it affects our judgment and our decision making as well.
There's a concept from driving. So if you drive on the motorway and you're going really fast, you become velocitized.
Right.
So you become used to the speed at which you're traveling.
Yeah.
And then when you pull off and have to slow down in a residential neighborhood, it feels really, really, really slow.
Right.
So I always think of people, when you live and operate in these bubbles of people who are very similar to you, you become velocitized. You normalize your own experience.
I like the velocitized word. I'm going to start using that.
Yeah, I think it's a good one.
But yeah, it's why you can call this a nudge in and of itself, but painting lines on a road to help to create the visual illusion of you going faster than you actually are. The spacing of the lines being closer and closer together, it makes you feel like you're going faster than you are.
Interesting.
Encourages you to slow down.
There's so much behavioural science in play. Come back to this novel new study because it was really interesting, the results.
Yeah. So there are, I think, loads of interesting things here. So, for example, we asked people how much their household unit spends on groceries every month. And if you're in the higher income group, then you spend about £450 every month on your household groceries. And if you're in the lower income group, you spend about half that much, spend about £250. Right? That's not surprising, okay, that people in higher incomes spend more on their groceries. One thing that was surprising, though, to me anyway, was that people in both of those groups were quite good at predicting what individuals in the other group spent. So if you're in a low income group, you imagine that people in the higher income group spend about twice as much as you do.
Yeah.
And if you're in the higher income group, you correctly estimate that people spend about half as much as you do. I think they said it was £300 rather than $250.
It was pretty close though.
Yeah. So pretty accurate. And a similar, albeit slightly more nuanced picture emerges when it comes to housing costs.
Yeah.
So it turns out, again, that people in higher income groups, they spend about twice as much on their housing. On average, they spend about £875 a month on their household costs. And in the lower income groups, it's less than half that. It's about £410.
Mm-hmm.
But this is where some of the nuance starts to emerge, which I found really interesting, which is that within each of our different groups, there is a lot of difference in the spending of people within our high income group and within our low income group. So, for example, 32% of our low earners don't spend anything on their housing each month, and 25%, so actually a smaller proportion of our higher income group, spend nothing on their housing costs each month. It has a massive impact upon your disposable income. So it affects you very differently if you're in one of those categories or another.
It does. And kind of acknowledging that I come to this with all my own behavioural biases,
Yeah.
I looked at the result and I instantly made the assumption that the people in the lower earning category were potentially living at home, for example, still with parents or other family to save on rent or save on mortgage payments. Whereas I didn't make that assumption on the higher earners.
The pattern is a little bit more nuanced because a significant minority in both groups are in that position because they've paid off their mortgage.
Uh-huh.
And so you might be earning less money, but you've paid off your principal residence.
Yeah.
And you're therefore able to live your financial life quite differently as a consequence.
Yeah, you can earn less money by choice. You might choose to change career, for example.
Yeah. So we had this pattern, which I think was interesting, but not necessarily unexpected when it comes to spending. When it comes to savings, I think the picture starts to like dramatically change.
Yeah, it was really interesting.
Yeah. So we asked everybody again, how much do you have in savings?
How much was left at the end of the month?
How much do you have left at the end of every month? And here the gap starts to open up dramatically between our higher earners and our lower earners, and also the ability of people to predict the situation that the others lie in. So when it comes to money left at the end of the month, our higher earners, they typically have £1,000 left at the end of each month, with massive variation within that. Remember, this is the median in our distribution. For the lower income earners, it's £250, but 14% of our lower earners say they've got nothing at the end of every month, which is like a high number when it comes to financial resilience, which is ultimately like what's important for a lot of these people.
And wasn't it 4% of higher earners had nothing?
Yeah, 4% of higher, and this is it's the interesting picture, which is that not everybody in our high earner bracket has huge amounts of financial resilience. 4% is not a lot, but it's close to sort of 1 in 20 people having nothing left at the end of the month, and 2% of our higher income earners have no savings as well.
Yeah,
which is again maybe not surprising, but it shows you that it's much more than just I earn lots of money, therefore I'm quote well off.
Yeah.
When actually, if you think about financial resilience from a what are you able to do on a day-to-day basis, the picture is a little bit more nuanced. But as I say, it really starts to open up in these kinds of areas, because 24% of our lower income groups say they've got nothing in savings.
Yeah.
Which is not dissimilar from other studies that have been run around, what would happen if you find yourself in a situation where you just need to find £500 to pay for some sort of an emergency expenditure. You find that this significant minority of people, especially in that lower income group, just say, well,
I can't.
They wouldn't be able to.
Yeah, there's a wide variety of studies on this. The one I often refer to is the Money and Pension Service.
Yeah.
Look at kind of savings levels, and they find a quarter of the population has £100 or less.
Yeah.
And 17% have nothing. So
yeah.
So that aligns actually really nicely with what we found here.
Yeah. So it accords with lots of this finding. And also, this is where some of our kind of predictions start to shift as well. So interestingly, our lower earners, when they were asked about how much money they thought our higher earners might have left at the end of the month, they got it spot on.
£1,000. They knew it.
Yeah. So their sort of intuition was bang on. Whereas our higher earners actually thought that the lower earners would have much less at the end of the month, about half of what they actually do. Mm-hmm. And a not dissimilar pattern emerges when it comes to savings, except that our lower earners, they knew that the higher earners would have much more in savings than they would, but they were quite far off, right? So they thought it would be about £10,000 rather than the £25,000 that it actually is.
Yeah, because it's sort of an unfathomably large amount. If you're earning under £25,000, to think that somebody else might just have that amount swilling around in cash, just feels ludicrous.
And then the third category, which then sort of ties all of these other elements together, is this question we asked them, which is like, how long could you survive if you lost your principal source of income? How many days could you survive? And in some ways, like this, I think sort of summarizes the different situations that our two groups find themselves in. Okay, so our higher income earners, the median reported number, so the middle of our distribution is 180 days.
So 6 months.
6 months. It's like half a year.
Yeah.
And that happens to be almost exactly the same as what most financial advisors will say is good practice. So Martin Lewis, for example, the money saving expert, says, ideally, if you can get 6 months of expenditure in your savings so that you can make use of it if you end up in a financially difficult situation at some point.
Yeah.
And our higher earners are in that position, right? They could last for 6 months.
For 6 months.
On average. Some of them, as we've discovered, it's more nuanced than that. Some of them couldn't. So about 13% of them said they couldn't survive a month, and some of them say they could go a lot longer, but on
Ye-
average
years
it's
they could-
half a
yeah,
year.
yeah.
Whereas the predicament for our lower earners is much more precarious. So on average their figure is 75 days. So let's call it just over a couple of months.
Yeah.
Far more of them say that they couldn't survive more than a month. So about 36% of our lower earners say that they couldn't go for more than a month. So more than a third of individuals within that group. And interestingly, we see again this distinction as well between our predictions. So our higher earners actually think that the situation that the lower earners might face is worse than that. They say probably on average it'll be about 30 days, not 75.
So they underestimate how long a low earner can go for.
Yeah, exactly. And
they also underestimated savings levels as well, didn't they? By about 2/3.
They did, yeah. So they estimated that they'd have about £1,000 in savings on average, whereas actually it's more like 3,000. And our lower earners also underestimate quite significantly the financial resilience of our higher earners. So they say it'll be about 3 months rather than the 6 months that it actually is. And for me, that figure is kind of almost more important than the other ones, because it's really about, if the situation for you from a financial perspective turns sour. Remember, this is a survey of people who are in full-time work. Then the context and the situations that our two groups find themselves in is very, very different.
Yeah, I want to point out that this is not a nationally representative sort of survey.
Yeah.
So we're discussing it and drawing some conclusions from it, but they don't kind of extrapolate out across the population as a whole, particularly because we excluded the group of sort of middle earners.
Yes,
we
exactly.
only looked at two ends of things.
Yeah.
But really interesting in terms of sort of the direction of travel, kind of the themes that came out.
Exactly.
And so that was interesting for me, was this idea that things weren't as bad as higher earners predicted for lower earners. And I think the tide has really turned on that. And I don't know if this is sort of the last 2 years of media around cost of living, because again, we did a piece of research at WageStream a couple of years ago that looked at kind of how frequently people had money worries.
Right.
And at that time, around a quarter of people who we would describe as maybe lower earners were worrying about money every single day.
Yeah.
Whereas managers were predicting that figure was more like 2%. So they were way off the mark. Whereas this has flipped around in our two groups here.
It has. We did ask people that question as well around their financial worries.
Yes.
And what we found was that, again, there was this sort of dramatically different picture for our lower and higher earners, but it wasn't quite as dramatic as when you last asked that question. So if you're in the lower income group, you worry about money weekly or daily. So I think about 10% said daily, 20% said weekly. So that suggests that there is a bit of a shift. But again, what we find is that in that higher income group, 10% of people are saying they do worry about money every day or every week. So there's still individuals within that group of higher earners who aren't considering their financial situation and thinking, I've got it easy here.
One of the other things we looked at in this study was how people use different financial products. So we looked at overdrafts and buy now, pay later.
Yes.
And again, putting my biases on the table, I had the assumption going into this that we would see a really different usage pattern across these two groups.
Yes.
But we didn't at all.
We didn't at all, no.
Nothing was different about it.
So about 60% of people in our higher income groups and our lower income groups say they've never used buy now, pay later. Yeah. But the remainder have done, and some of them do it quite frequently. And the most frequent users are actually in our
we found
higher
the higher
income
earners used
group.
it slightly more. But like me, our higher earners predicted that they would see much more frequent use from the lower earner group. Or they dramatically underestimated the proportion who just would never have used it. So, Owain, one of the reasons why I really wanted to do this research, apart from you telling me that it was boring not to have something fresh to talk about, was I think a lot about who gets to make decisions. So who gets to make decisions about policy, about products, about service design. And do they really understand who they're making decisions for?
Yeah.
So again, kind of coming back to that point that I'm not sure a lot of people recognize that median pay sits at around £35,000 a year, and it quite quickly jumps up. You don't have to earn a lot more than that before you're in the 75th percentile, or even sort of into the 90s. So for example, every single one of our elected MPs who's now earning over £91,000 a year, they're in the 95th percentile of earnings. So they're in the top 5% of all earners. And so when I did some salary benchmarking and I looked at what are the different types of roles that might feasibly be making decisions beyond MPs.
Yeah.
And so I used a tool called Pave to do some salary benchmarking. And I looked at entry-level roles. So I looked at things like product managers, product designers, software engineers, project managers, graphic designers, business intelligence, data analysts, data scientists, anybody in HR, so an HR generalist, an HR business partner, someone in people operations. And even at the entry level, every single one of these roles using salary benchmarking, they were all earning beyond the median wage.
We've set the study up that we've just talked about in a way to help to illustrate some of these points. But I still, when you rattle through the figures, I still find it really surprising.
And that's the thing, listeners, if you're sitting here at home and you're not kind of recognizing yourself as a higher earner, but if you're earning more than £35,000, you are. If you're earning more than £43,000, you're in the 75th percentile, and more than £65,000 puts you in the 90th percentile. So who gets to make decisions? So it seems to me I couldn't find a single example of a role earning less than the median who was in any sort of position of authority around a product design decision, even a copywriting decision, an HR decision, a compensation decision, how we interpret data. And we were speaking the other day about kind of the decisions people make and the policies that happen and how this affects the majority. And there's a really interesting example I want to talk about now, which is national minimum wage legislation.
Oh, yeah.
So, it is against the law for employers to pay less than national minimum wage. And the unintended consequence of this, the minimum wage is a brilliant policy. It's helped many, many people get a big lift in their pay. But the unintended consequence is that workplace benefits delivered through salary sacrifice, so think cycle to work scheme, or think a workplace nursery scheme, or kind of anything else through salary sacrifice. If you earn at or near the national minimum wage, you often can't have those, because businesses and payroll functions are terrified of inadvertently moving your pay below that threshold, which I don't think a lot of people understand the implication of. Everyone in payroll knows this, but I don't think a lot of people understand the implication of that piece of legislation. And this is what I mean by that people in power, the people making decisions, don't have that as lived experience. And the reason why this happens is, imagine you are on sort of a variable hours contract or doing shift-based work, and you would normally earn maybe each month £150 above the minimum wage threshold. But in 1 month, you don't work as much and you have some unpaid leave, and now you're below it. If you have deductions on your pay to go towards cycle to work scheme or to go towards a workplace nursery, all of a sudden your employer has broken the law. Right? And they can be fined many millions, and HMRC has been known for being quite aggressive in pursuing employers, or even naming and shaming who break the law. And so I looked at, just to bring this to life, if you were earning minimum wage and you're still paying tax on minimum wage, about a third of your income is taxable over the year, and you were paying for nursery, you wouldn't be able to do that through salary sacrifice. But if you had that available to you as an option, you'd be putting another £120 per month back in your pocket.
Wow. Yeah.
Which is really meaningful.
Yeah.
And when we look at who's in different tax thresholds, again, 80% of us are basic rate taxpayers. There's a big swathe of people who kind of live in that bucket where they are near the median, or again, around 2 million people earn the national minimum wage, and another 500,000 earn the real living wage, which puts you in that risk category of you're just not able to take advantage of something that a higher earner, even a moderately higher earner, can take advantage of.
One thing, which I think is what you're really getting to the heart of, is this ability to empathize with people who are in different situations to yourself. And again, when we set up the behavioural insights team, the nudge unit, a lot of the focus was on, hey, there are these interesting biases that we're all subject to. But in some ways, like the more fundamental changes that we started to make was in how we thought about making those changes in the first place. And one of the things we started to do was to try and put ourselves in the shoes of the people who were going through those experiences themselves. So especially my colleagues spent a lot of time in job centres before we did this big program of work with Job Centre Plus, just to find out what it actually feels like for somebody who's signing up for the first time to Job Centre Plus.
Yeah, walking in there.
And one of the things that they found, again, a great example of something we were also talking about earlier, which is like sludge, is that the first part of that process is just really intensely sludge heavy, or at least it was, right? It was form after form after form. So they found that you had to fill in 9 different forms as your first experience trying to sign on to Job Centre Plus. So a lot of the focus of that program was, how can we flip this around so that the focus is on trying to get that person back to work rather than getting them to prove who they say they are and to fill in form after form after form. But if you're sat in Whitehall, okay, you've not ever been to a job centre before. No. You're a policymaker you probably are in that situation I was describing before, which is you're comparing yourself to your mates who are
your
management
well-paid
consultants
peers,
or investment bankers, and you think that you're actually like on a pretty low salary, but actually you're in that, you're in the
90th percentile,
category. And you can't imagine actually what it would be like to sign on for the first time. And if you have been to a job centre, it would be in a kind of management type capacity. And that's where I think a lot of the methods, and this has started to change, right? Institutions within Whitehall started to think, okay, what the very first thing that you need to do is to really try to understand what it feels like to experience these
Flex
sorts
that
of services.
empathy muscle.
Yeah. And we're very, very far away from being able to do that in practice. But this is a good example of that.
Yeah. I've been to a job centre. So when I moved to the UK nearly 21 years ago, because you don't sort of evolve into having a national insurance number, you got to go and do it. And I remember it was somewhere in Kilburn, and taking the bus there and having all my paperwork with me. And then I remember marching around that day doing everything else I could think of now that I had all my proof of IDs and this and that with me. I just really remember distinctly having to bundle everything up about me.
How did it feel for you going into a job centre for the first time?
Gosh, that's a good question. I don't really remember being particularly stressed about it, but my circumstances were I was new to country and I was needing to get a national insurance number. And I wasn't working yet. I was looking for work, but I wasn't. Firstly, I had a visa in my passport with a big no recourse to public funds stamped on it. So I wasn't going in there to get support for being out of work. So it was an administrative task for me that felt burdensome, but was necessary.
I think one of the things that I was really struck by, and actually it sort of will live with me forever, I think, in that project that I just described, was that my colleague spent literally weeks inside the job centre, and a lot of the work that we then did to design how things could operate differently were done within the job centre. I spent a couple of days in one particular job centre and sat in on some of the interviews that the job advisors give to people who are signing on for the first time. And there were a couple of these interviews that really stayed with me. One of them was with a guy who was in his 60s. He'd just been made redundant, and he'd been doing the same job since he was 16.
Oh, wow.
Okay, so he'd been doing this job for 50 years that he'd just been made redundant from. And the kind of questions that he were being asked was, what kind of searches have you been doing for new jobs? What kind of jobs have you been looking for?
Yeah.
And he was just looking for the same job that he'd been doing. The problem was, like, that job didn't exist anymore. That's why he'd been made redundant. He was a guillotine operator in a paper factory. And you could just see what it felt like for him, which was just this sort of devastating moment of realization. And I think that's the reality for a lot of people in that situation. And it's impossible to like truly put yourself in the shoes of an individual like that. But it is possible to get closer to that sensation of, being able to empathize a bit with the predicament that a different person has from your own set of circumstances. So I think what you're describing is really, really important.
I think our research shows us that there was some ability to kind of imagine other people's circumstances, but kind of the empathy gap that was there was in understanding outcomes. And I think there's sort of another concept called misplaced paternalism. And I think there's a tendency sometimes of higher earners to have this, which is they underestimated how much money was left at the end of the month for lower earners. They underestimated how much savings lower earners were able to put away. I come back to this empathy gap again, which is it's just really hard for us to imagine other people's circumstances. And it's equally hard for us to imagine maybe other people thriving in circumstances that we can't see ourselves thriving in. And I want to talk about the second piece of research that we did together, where we had a national conversation about money.
Yes.
And this one is nationally representative.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So for this study, we used a Cogco platform that we built called Akota to ask a question. So in this case, the question was, what are some of the ways that you personally manage your money? And rather than just asking people that question and finding out how they might respond, with Akota, what you can do is you can get people to give a response to that question. And then everybody else can either give their own response or they can say what they think about your response. So we had this nationally representative sample. So in this case, it's not just workers, people from across the country, mixed genders, mixed age groups, mixed income profiles. So it's not just lower income and higher income.
And the first thing that came through was, although the question asked, how do you manage your money? There was a lot of platitudes in there, or what did you call it? Apple pie and
motherhood and apple pie.
Motherhood. We'll stick to platitudes.
We'd say motherhood and apple pie is all about things that everybody would agree are good things.
Yeah, like be kind to others and
exactly. So in a bygone era, if you asked anybody, do you like apple pie? Literally everybody would say yes. Maybe today, some people would say no. I prefer
like apple pie?
I prefer a chocolate tart. But yeah, platitudes is maybe a better phrase.
Okay, so a lot of people said things like you should, put money aside every payday, or you should, look after the pennies and the pounds will take care of themselves. And there was like dozens of these phrases that had very high consensus.
Yeah. So what's interesting is that you always get certain opinions that are submitted that are kind of more general. And in those lists of platitudes, saving a little if you can, saving for an emergency fund is a wise move.
Yeah.
Pretty much everybody says that they would agree with that. About 90% of people say that they agree, and most of the rest of the people say that they don't know. And there's very little difference across like the income spectrum as well. We had a total of 88 opinions submitted across our group and 16,500 votes.
So quite a lot of data collected.
Yeah. And the other nice thing about Akota, which is that actually it's built to make it really easy to engage with other people's opinions. But if you feel like your view has not been given, then you can submit that as a separate opinion yourself.
It's very low friction, not a lot of sludge in there.
Yeah, no, I would say zero sludge, but actually probably like 2% sludge.
Okay. So people all agreed with the platitudes or the apple pie statements.
Yeah.
But then when it got down to behaviors, so what do people actually do?
For me, one of the most interesting source of statements were people saying like, I pay off my credit card bill every month. Okay? 55% of people say that that's what they do. But that obviously leaves like a group of people who aren't able to do that.
Yeah.
I keep an emergency fund of 6 months of expenses. Well, we saw earlier that's like actually a really potentially fundamentally important thing. 40% of people are able to do that. And obviously, as we saw earlier, that's especially individuals in that higher income.
Yeah, we didn't.
Group.
I know the data was sort of, there was a distribution, but really we didn't see a lot of that in the lower earning group. So that's a statement that you could do that based on having money left over at the end of the month.
These are the submissions of real people giving their own voice to different issues. And sometimes it's the nuance between similar opinions that are submitted that are quite revealing. So in this case, we have both people saying saving for an emergency fund is a wise move. 90% of people agree to that. But if you say, I keep an emergency fund of 6 months of expenses, then only 40% of people, 41% of people say that that's what they can agree to. So it's like a lot of people understand that that's a good thing, but then don't do it or aren't able to do it. So one of the areas I found really interesting was all around the use of cash. And you express a statement about how you use cash. And if you say, I only use cash to control spending. 29% of people agree with that, but most people will disagree with a statement like that. In relation to that cash situation, this is where some of the interesting nuances, I think, creep in. So if you say that you are in a position to save money in cash so that you can then spend it on things, then that is associated with increases in your financial satisfaction. But if you say that you use cash to control your spending, so it's more associated with like in the moment impulse purchases.
So kind of enveloping, so using cash as a way of budgeting for things.
Yeah. Then that's associated with financial concerns, financial worries, and reduces your financial satisfaction. It links to this concept in the behavioral science literature known as scarcity. So scarcity is a kind of quite a complex concept.
It's one of my favorites.
One of your favorite, yeah. So it's made manifest in lots of different ways. But in the book Scarcity, they really focus on time and they focus on money.
Yeah.
And what they find is that if you are in a position of financial constraint, then you are in a position of financial scarcity, right? Obviously. But their interest in studying scarcity, they look at the psychological impact that has upon you,
particularly around decision making.
Yeah. And what they find is that there's this interesting phenomenon, which I think is at play in this study, which is that if you're in a position of financial scarcity, you end up focusing on your financial predicament.
With sort of an unconscious fixation with it.
Yeah.
That kind of consumes your intellectual bandwidth.
Yes.
So you struggle to make good decisions about money.
Exactly. So this idea of all of us, we have cognitive bandwidth, right? The ability to have sort of spare capacity in our decision making, but sometimes that bandwidth gets consumed, right? And if you are in a position of low financial resources, what you often end up is being incredibly good at budgeting in the here and now.
Yeah, great short-term behaviors because you have to.
Yeah. But the kicker is that it's often at the expense of the longer term decision making, right? So I think that is a really good explanation for what's happening here in terms of this difference between the individual who's able to save proactively for the next few months and so has the financial resilience that gives them extra cognitive bandwidth, versus the individual who's in that position where they're having to think about the day-to-day and is controlling their expenditure, but they're controlling it more in the moment and not necessarily able to think about those longer-term decisions that are ultimately, in the long term, much more important for them.
Yeah, well, this is something that we're going to explore more deeply when we turn this into a paper and not just a chat.
Yeah.
Because I think it's really fascinating. This is a good moment to sort of stop and reflect, and I want to wrap up from here. And on the Invisible Worker podcast, I always ask, what is the one thing about this worker who is typically earning at or less than the median wage, often doing frontline or essential work? What is the one thing about them, their circumstances, the way they approach money, their lives that you wish other people knew? And so with your behavioural science hat on, do you have a one thing to throw out there?
So that is really interesting. The one thing, which I'm going to take in a slightly different direction, if that's okay with you, which is that I want everybody who's listening to this, who's a product manager, who's a policymaker, who's a data scientist, to take that element of empathy with them and to think, how can I put myself in the shoes of the people who I am building product for? And how can I put myself in the shoes of people who are maybe outside of my immediate horizon through, experiencing those services, those products from the point of view of the people that we're really interested in terms of the invisible worker.
I love that. Flex the empathy muscle.
Yeah.
Put yourself in the shoes of others. Thank you so much. We've had Owain Service, CEO of Cogco and founder of the Behavioural Insights team on the Invisible Worker podcast.
Thanks, Emily.
Before you go, make sure you stay in touch. Please subscribe to the Invisible Worker podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you go to listen. That way you can follow along as we release new episodes. Thanks again, and see you soon.